So obviously this is the broad left. Everybody's welcome. And we've got some great lineup of speakers tonight. And obviously about disputes that are going on. But also some of the successes that have happened within Usdaw. So I won't sort of hang around too long because I think it's really important to hear from them. So our first speaker tonight is going to be Iain Dalton, who is the chair of the Broad Left. And I'd like to hand over to Iain, if you're there.
I need to unmute myself. Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Broad Left meeting. We thought it was important to, we'd usually gather on a Saturday night to discuss the agenda, but we thought in the age of Zoom, we could try and use Zoom to have a bit of a public meeting to, you know, discuss where the union is at and what the way forward is. And that. So I'm going to focus really on the retail crisis and what strategy we need to save members' jobs, because this last year has been a brutal one for retail workers. Many retail workers have been furloughed during the past year, not knowing when and if our shops would reopen. We've seen big names like the Arcadia Group and Debenhams both go under, with those companies and the online retailers that have bought their brands trying to palm off paying redundancy onto the taxpayer as well. But even in those companies who remain trading during lockdown, especially the supermarkets where many of our union's members are concentrated, then retail workers have been put on the front line. Before mask wearing in shops was introduced last year, then deaths from COVID among shop workers were 75% higher for men and 60% higher for women than amongst the general population. But these big supermarkets have, when you look at their financial figures, had a fairly good pandemic. All of them report increased like-for-like sales, with the exception of fuel, which they all expect to bounce back. Tesco's like-for-like sales are up 7%. Morrison's are up 8.6%, just to give a few examples. And when you actually dig into their financial reports, far from the kind of difficult year that it's been portrayed when they speak to the media about it, then you know, they all talk about how well they've done and how they are expecting to be, in the words of Tesco's key headlines on their report, well set for the current year, strong improvement in profitability expected whilst trading conditions are likely to remain volatile. You know, they think they've done well, and therefore that was the basis, for example, of Tesco saying in their report that they're making an exception to the policy to ensure that share dividends for the year were the same as the previous year, which in their words, they said that reflected the importance which the board placed on dividends paid to shareholders and its confidence in future cash flows. And those same shareholders who were guaranteed the same dividends had got before COVID also got an extra £5 billion in payouts last year from the sale of Tesco's Asian holdings. And even with Sainsbury's, who posted a technical loss, and I call it a technical loss because they paid off £610 million of net debt, which was you know, double the loss they reported. They paid both their delayed dividend from the previous financial year and a half-year dividend as well. And Morrison's actually paid out a 27% bigger dividend to their shareholders than the previous year, up from 8.77 pence per share to 11.15 pence per share. And again, their financial report says, our business has reacted and responded very well throughout the pandemic. Both our absolute and relative trading performance has been consistently strong. We are confident we can continue our momentum into the new year and expect both profit growth and a significant reduction in net debt. So they all think they're doing very well. And their shareholders are doing very well too. But it hasn't exactly been the same for retail workers. Yes, there's been one-off bonuses, but for example, Sainsbury's, who claimed to introduce leading rates of pay into 2018, their pay rate since then has only risen 30p to £9.50 an hour. Morrison's workers are now on £10 an hour. The union's demand for some years, as I think some employers have felt obliged to concede some rises, but following, which really follows from the events of last year in showing just how vital retail and distribution workers are in keeping society going. But in reality, I think that only shows, goes to show, how the union should be updating the £10 an hour demand, which we adopted 6 years ago. But prices since then are now, over, about, 1.10 times higher today, according to the Office for National Statistics. So even going on their figures, and they will use a lower inflation figure, and that we should be arguing for £11 an hour, if not taking a leaf from the NHS workers, putting forward a bolder demand of 15% pay rise and going further and calling for £12 or even more than that an hour. And even in these companies that have had a good pandemic, then we've had announcements of job losses. 3,000 in Sainsbury's and Argos through closures of counters and standalone Argos stores. There's been other companies that have closed counters like Tesco's as well. Asda put 5,000 jobs at risk in February this year, and then just a week or so ago, a further 1,200 through ending scratch baking in store. There's been job losses potentially reported in the co-op that's been discussed on the Usdaw forum in the last week. And these are part and parcel of the 180,000 retail sector job losses in 2020, with many more on the cards to come this year. The Arcadia and most of the Debenhams job losses are not included in that figure. And yes, we face a threat to bricks and mortar retail from online retail and the likes of companies like Amazon. But I think we have to understand that that is not just a question of an inevitable march of technology, that bricks and mortar will be dead and that, but it's also a product of the policies that governments have adopted towards things, such as the tax loopholes that the likes of Amazon exploit, which need closing. But even if those were dealt with, then at its base, I think the threat from those sorts of companies comes from the super exploitation of their workforce, both in warehouses where there's horror stories about people having to pee in bottles and so on because they're not allowed breaks for the toilet and that, but also amongst delivery drivers and that. And anyone who's had anything delivered during lockdown, which is probably the vast majority of the population now, because it's been the only way to get certain things, will have had an experience of a delivery driver, basically just dumping stuff on your doorstep or wherever and rushing off because of the rate they're expected to get through deliveries, which means regular people working over their hours and so on. And I think this, trying to protect this sort of super exploitation that's been going on was the reason Amazon poured such vast resources into defeating the attempt to unionize at the warehouse in Bessemer in Alabama recently, where Amazon have won the battle, but I think there's an ongoing war that will need to take place, and ourselves and other unions in the UK need to be driving at trying to organise those workers as well. But I want to try to finish with, well, how do we fight these retail job losses? There was recently produced a retail recovery plan from Usdaw, and there's one or two good points in that, I think, that are a step forward from what we previously said, such as incorporating some of the demands arising from the pandemic, relating to our working conditions, things like sick pay from day one, which I noticed, my branch put forward on the for ADM, but that's been adopted in that already, although the minimum wage figure still remains at the outdated £10 an hour. But I think the overall approach of that document can be summed up as protectionism for the profits of the high street and supermarket retailers. And I think that will not help save retail jobs in the long run. I think what we have to, the first essential demand that we have to make in response to any closures and job losses that I haven't seen in that retail recovery plan is that, we want companies to open the books and show us where the profits have gone. The classic example of how retail has been used as a credit card for their owners is the Philip Green saga of asset stripping at BHS and the other companies he's run. And we've seen during COVID how several retailers have spun the media presentation of their financial situation and prospects to justify job losses. And it's crucial that we as workers take a position where we don't just accept what management tells us, but we've put forward what is in the interest of our members, and we challenge job losses rather than just try to manage them. But if companies are in those sorts of serious financial crises where the cash flows are not sustainable and jobs are seriously threatened, then what next? The retail recovery plan suggests cutting business rates, cutting rents, and an online sales levy. All these things would would give more weight to the profitability of bricks and mortar stores over online retail. But there are consequences to them. Business rate cuts, for example, would have a knock-on effect on the finances of local government that have been made dependent on them through the Tory government's cuts. So, unless, that would have problems unless alternative funding for councils came from the government. But that would require a battle, that currently isn't being waged to be fought for it. But even if those measures were implemented, I think we have to question whether they'd be enough to halt the wave of store closures we're seeing. And I think looking towards Sheffield can provide some answers, because last summer, in an attempt to aid John Lewis to have a flagship store in the city, then Sheffield Council bought the building that store was in to provide them with cheaper terms on their lease for that. But just a month or so ago, then John Lewis announced they were going to close the store anyway after the council had spent loads of taxpayers' money on subsidising them. And I think what we ought to be really pushing to the fore is the demand that we raised back at the 2017 conference on the back of the BHS debacle, where we said that the union should be raising the question of nationalisation of companies who go into administration or other situation where the jobs of our members and other retail distributors and allied workers are under threat. And unfortunately, we have never done that. But I think it goes to show really that that is a fundamental thing that we need to be arguing for, because our employers are driven by making profit from our labour, and fundamentally they will protect that at whatever cost is necessary, including that of our jobs, and that we have to take that motivation out of the equation. This last year has shown just how vital the jobs that our members do in frontline retail, in the back, in behind the scenes distribution side, and food manufacturing and pharmaceuticals and elsewhere as well. These are vital things for society, and we should be saying that, as the rule book says, we should be working towards these things being under the control of working people, and that means, in my opinion, that we need to be starting to campaign for public ownership and democratic control by elected representatives of workers of our companies. That is some way from where the union is now, but we can start that by going back to what we were doing with the Save Our Shops campaign, publicly campaigning in the streets, as workers have done, around Debenhams in this country and in Ireland, and challenge, starting by challenging, the companies making these job losses. We cannot continue to have this position of allowing management's right to manage if that means our members lose their jobs and lose their livelihoods, So I hope that's provided some ideas for people to discuss, but I think this is going to be a growing question that we face throughout the course of the coming years, and I hope that we can discuss this issue amongst the many other issues we've faced at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that, Iain. That was a really good insight into what is happening, and how awful it is out there, and what these big companies are getting up to and getting away with, basically, and how, as unions, we need to be stepping up to the plate, and making sure that gets put right. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who unfortunately can't actually speak in person tonight. We should have had a striker from Deliveroo, Cristian Santabarbera, from York IWGB, chair and Deliveroo striker, but he has sent a message to us and I'm going to read that out from him. So away we go, if that's all right with everyone. So Cristian says, our recent strike on the 7th of April was massively successful. Deliveroo went in at lowest end of IPO, 7.6 billion. Our efforts to highlight their exploitation knocked 30% off in the first week, with 12 massive investors publicly denouncing Deliveroo. It stood at 4.5 billion. When the shares went full public on the day of our demo, they dropped another 9%. Marcus Rashford got involved to support us due to his links with the Deliveroo and their exploitative practices. Deliveroo branded as self-appointed and a fringe organisation, which really just shows how rattled they were and are. The IWGB organises sectors that were previously branded unorganisable, but in some local chapters like Reading, around 75 to 80% of the couriers threw down tools and stood in solidarity, which was heroic. Our work regularly brings us into contact with other workers in the companies we deliver from. We want to work with BFAWU to organise our local fast food workers in York restaurants and build a local solidarity network with wider unions and campaign groups, including with retail workers organised in the big supermarket chains in Usdaw. I apologise I couldn't be at the meeting in person, but the platform conditions dictate our working times and my absence speaks the shallow falsehood of the flexibility that Deliveroo claims it provides. Solidarity to all. So that was the message that I received earlier, which, you know, I think we all agree, solidarity to all those workers and all workers that are in struggle. But it just goes to show, again, you know, together, it does make a difference. I'm sure people will have questions of the speakers, but I think I've sort of jumped the gun a bit there. I'm hoping that people are happy to come in for questions once the speakers have all finished. Are we all happy with that? Yeah, fantastic. So that was from Cristian. Our next speaker is Jordan Rivera from NHS Workers Say No to Public Sector Pay Inequality. And I'd like to invite you now, Jordan, to have your say. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. So my name's Jordan Rivera. I'm an occupational therapist and I work at Homerton Hospital in London, and I'm a Unison steward. I'm going to talk a bit about the pandemic and what we've been through, and then about the fight for a pay rise and why we all need to stick together. So I've been involved with campaigning for a pay rise for NHS workers since last year. When I think back to the start of the pandemic, many people commented back then that you could really tell who was essential, who was really essential, that it was health workers, it was delivery drivers, shop workers, carers, etc., and not politicians and managers. It's still awful for me to think back to that time, because it was so awful for me, and at the same time, but I just can't help thinking about it all the time. There was a day at work when I got a strange feeling in my stomach because I'd smiled at somebody and I realised I hadn't smiled at all for about 4 or 5 days, and my face had just been in this look of misery and shock all that time at work. And thinking back to that time in April last year when the streets were completely deserted, when there were often buses with only myself and one other person on it, when a key worker could have that crazy experience of seeing London completely deserted because everyone was frightened to death indoors at home. Well, us key workers, we were frightened too, but we still had to go to work. In the hospitals, we were working with people we knew had a deadly infectious disease, and we didn't have the PPE we needed to look after ourselves, and we still had to go to work. And you know, when I went into my local supermarket, people at that time, they looked like they were in a war, and I recognised that look of fear on the faces of the staff there, because it was the same feeling I'd been feeling, terrified, but we still had to go to work. Well, I've been reliving all that again a bit, trying to get across a bit just how it felt at the time, because when I hear the comments now that health workers are greedy for expecting a pay rise when other people don't have work, it just feels like people have forgotten what this country's been through. The reason a pay rise is essential for the NHS is because after living through all of that, people are just starting to ask themselves, is the money that we earn, is it really worth it? We just have to work so hard and our pay stagnated the value of our pay has dropped by over 20% over the last 10 years because of pay freezes in the NHS. And after what we've been through, it just feels like a travesty to be so undervalued. When nurses are working on wards where they're short-staffed, the work is so hard. You're trying to keep up with everything you have to do when every decision you're making is impacting on a real person's life, and every person you haven't been able to do all you need for. That is a real person, and it's someone's loved one. The responsibility is immense, and NHS workers should be fairly paid. To hear that the government felt we're only worth 1%, it was a real shock. I mean, I wasn't expecting them to offer us much, but I genuinely thought they'd offer us more than that. For qualified nurses, that would be around £3.50 per week pay rise, but so many staff are on a lower band than that. So if when I was going around talking to colleagues, I had to break it down to healthcare assistants that because their pay is lower, their pay increase would be even lower than that. And it's just not enough to make a difference. So where are we with our pay campaign? So yeah, the NHS workers say no, they've been campaigning for a 15% pay rise, because that is what we need to make up for the money that we've lost over all these years. So all the different health unions are campaigning for different amounts, but they're all campaigning for a significant pay rise. So in Scotland, NHS workers have been offered 4%, but this is just slightly less of an insult than 1%. And it's, in my personal opinion, I think they should vote against this. And staff are being balloted at the moment about whether they accept or reject this. Here in England, we're still waiting for the outcome of the pay review body's decision. So our job as campaigners is to continue to do everything we can to campaign for a proper pay rise. The strength of feeling is really high amongst NHS workers about this issue, but the problem is people are really exhausted and they don't know what to do. But when we go to talk to people, they do want to fight. The unions need to give them a lead on this. We've got an NHS demo plan for the summer to tie in with the birthday of the NHS. And we're also planning events on the 12th of May, which is Nurses Day. There's always a day of celebrating nurses, but we think it should be a day for campaigning as well. We may end up having to take strike action to win this campaign, and we should be prepared to do so because the NHS just can't continue the way it is. And we need to link up with other workers in the same situation, because that can only benefit all of us. So, you know, it was really interesting listening to the last speaker. You know, what I'd written down to say at the end of that is just supermarkets make, you know, we know they make massive profits, but their workers are still not earning enough, you know, their wages close to minimum wage. So we're all fighting for a pay rise. We really want the same for you, and we need to stand together. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jordan. And I think we'll all agree, absolutely outrageous. 1%, it's an insult. I don't think I've spoken to one person that doesn't think that's absolutely atrocious what you've been offered. And I'm sure, you know, if it come to it, everyone would be out on the street. And, you know, it's an awful thing. We know how committed nurses and doctors are to their job roles. And we know that to, you know, even think about strike action. But there comes a point, you know, when you've been through so much, yeah, it's just absolutely outrageous. And, you know, we're fully behind you on whatever that looks like. So solidarity again there. Okay, I'm now going to bring in Richie, but before I do, so Richie Venton, who was viciously sacked by IKEA for standing up for his members as the elected workplace convener in the Glasgow IKEA store, had 550 workers, and basically what he was standing up for was that anyone off sick should be paid their full average wages, not lower sick benefits, not statutory sick pay of what was £95 a week. Now, I know Richie's going to speak to you on some, you know, different topic, more of a success story. But I, for one, feel that I wanted to just quickly highlight Richie's plight before I hand over to Richie. So basically at the end of May, IKEA announced from the 1st of June, anyone off with COVID would only get sick benefit. They'd also be penalised with absence points. And if they were above the points threshold, would have to survive on £95 a week statutory sick pay. Now, the National Union officials did nothing to oppose this. Richie stood up for workers and fought against it, warned that this could drag people through COVID, with COVID into work because muley out of hardship because they couldn't afford not to stay at home, which in turn would infect others and spread the COVID virus. He told his members what was happening and he was sacked for doing just that. I know for a fact, as a close friend of Richie's, that he went through absolute hell in that 6 months, from May to late November. But for me, the real regret or crime, whatever word you want to use, is that our National Union leadership never once publicly condemned his victimisation and never lifted a finger to build a protest movement to demand his reinstatement, even though he had built up the highest union membership of any IKEA store in Britain and Ireland, and also was an EC member. The battle was left to Richie on his own, or not on his own, with the rank and file trade unionists, and a lot of support came from other unions, but unfortunately, as I've already said, there was nothing out there from Usdaw. It was a fantastic campaign, over 10,000 signatures on a petition, hundreds of unions pledging their solidarity, hundreds joining several different demonstrations outside the IKEA stores, not just in Scotland, but in England and Ireland too, and protesting parts of Europe against his sacking. I myself actually took part in one of these protests alongside a couple of other EC members. And we were absolutely chastised and I'm, absolutely hauled over the coals at an EC meeting for doing just that. Myself as president basically being told, how dare I go into Manchester and Warrington. I was also supporting the Debenhams workers and also, which I had been invited by a Debenhams member. I was invited to the Richie protest by Trades Council. And as I said at the time, no one will ever tell me what I can say and what I can't say and what protest I attend and I won't. So to say I was chastised, it fell on deaf ears. If I'm honest, I would do it again tomorrow. And I know the EC members that were alongside me would do the same. But anyway, the courageous fight that Richie led was a real victory for all IKEA workers in Britain and Ireland. It forced back IKEA into doing a U-turn to pay their workers their wages since the 1st of September if they were off sick or self-isolating from COVID. Unfortunately for Richie, he never got his job back, but his principled stand won an important victory for all workers. And the campaign that was conducted should be an example to all of us in any situation like that, that actually taking the fight to the employers and not just having cosy chats with them is the way forward if there's no other way. So absolutely. So I'm now going to hand over to Richie. I just wanted to put that there because I know Richie, he won't do it himself, but over to you, Richie, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Amy. I think sisters, brothers and comrades, you'll understand that I'm not in a position legally to elaborate on that issue that Amy's just described. But let me put it this way, it's probably just one microcosm of the challenges that the working people face, because the employing class and their pet governments are not busy preaching class war only because they're too busy practicing it. They're getting ready to carve up society into a new abnormal as the coronavirus, allegedly at least, is brought under some degree of control, allegedly at least, because we see the way in which a second virus has erupted across the workplaces of Britain and beyond, of fire and rehire. We've seen the way in which the police bill and the other words in that name, in England at least, effectively threatens the right to protest. We saw the way in which the highly centralised police Scotland were deployed a couple of weeks ago against a perfectly peaceful and socially distanced picket by packaging firm Workers' Seca, it was called, in Edinburgh, broken up. Another example of the way in which COVID has been used as a smokescreen to attack some of the fundamental rights of working people. And who comes out on top in terms of the kind of future we face very short term will be determined by struggles. And likewise, that in turn is largely determined by what kind of trade unions we have. Now, long before I became an executive council member exactly 3 years ago, and during the 3 years since, I've seen firsthand two fundamental different types of trade unionism compete for influence, including in Usdaw, but more widely. On the one hand, we've got that adopted by those who are associated mostly with the kind of right wing of the Labour Party primarily, of social partnership, of collaboration with the tops of the companies, of a very small c conservative approach when it comes to the issue of taking action to defend the membership. That sort of tripartite or social partnership approach is still one that's prevalent at the tops of our own union, and in fact most of the unions in Britain, I would argue. The other type of trade unionism, which certainly I and we in this room, I'm sure, represent, is one which relies on the idea that we've got classes in society, and if we're going to defend the working class, we have to sometimes be prepared to confront the employing class, ABC stuff, and that relies on collectivism, on mobilisations, of being willing to organise members and to develop their understanding of the issues around fighting demands that can help to mobilise them into action for improvements and defence of their own conditions also. Now, since going on to the executive, I know Jean and Amy were there for quite a long time before I was, but since being on the EC for the last 3 years, let me describe what I think is important for comrades outside that body to understand, first of all. And that is that we have had some impact and made some progress in the duration of that period. For example, as was referred to already by Iain, the policy of a £10 minimum wage, which the left put forward in the first place, had lain dormant in a dusty room somewhere, untouched, unutilised as any kind of campaigning weapon for at least 4 years prior to us going on to the EC for the 3-year period in 2018. Immediately before that, a brand new policy was adopted, which I moved on behalf of our Glasgow No. 1 branch, which is that instead of 0 contracts and people suffering vast levels of underemployment and the poverty that goes hand in hand with it, that every worker who wanted it should be guaranteed a minimum working week of 16 hours for various reasons, without explaining all the reasons behind that figure. That was adopted at the 2018 ADM. And as soon as going on to the EC, my attitude was, and combined with the comrades like Amy and Jean in this respect and others, was to demand action on that policy, immediate policies that would relate to our own membership and improve their lives if it was implemented, and demanded campaign material, demanded plans for pursuing it, demanded measures to be taken to bring it into the wider trade union movement, and so on. Now, it wasn't that easy, because in the first month or two of the meetings, frankly, there was a lot of waffle from the top table, if you'll pardon the expression, the central officials, well, the General Secretary of the time, Hannett. And what we had to do was pin that down and demand concrete measures and put them forward in order to ensure a campaign. And we succeeded. We got it ticketed into the Wales TUC that summer. We got it proposed at the British TUC for September 2018 for those twin policies of the minimum wage and the 16-hour minimum. We subsequently raised it at the Scottish TUC the following spring, just a cycle of meetings as they happen. We also got it adopted, which was quite a sweet irony for me, at the Labour Party conference the following year. Sweet irony, because it was in the city of Liverpool that conference occurred, and over 30 years before, I'd been expelled by the Kinnock leadership of the Labour Party for being a socialist. And then in the same city, the Labour Party met and adopted a policy which started out as something I fought for in my own workplace and achieved, then wrote about in a book, and then proposed as a policy for Usdaw at its ADM. It was therefore sweet to see the way in which history had turned a certain circle and we got something progressive from the union adopted. Now, we also fought relentlessly to turn the union outwards and campaign on these policies. For example, for about 6 months, when I suggested coordinated days of action, going out on the streets, campaigning in all the different districts, or at least a few to begin with, then the usual answer was, well, Usdaw is not that kind of union. The members are not ready for that kind of activity, and so on. But eventually, in the early months of 2019, we achieved that. And we had a series of street stalls, street days of action on the Save Our Shops campaign, with the issue of the £10 and 16 hours at the very heart of it. Because after all, if you're going to save shops and retail jobs, one of the ways of doing it is to pay a decent wage and have a secure lifestyle and income for retail workers themselves, who make up the second biggest workforce in the country after the health service workers. So that's one step that would help to secure more retail jobs. So that also was alongside the fact that any time, and other comrades here will testify to this, any time there was backsliding on policies, we fought it, and were just relentless in demanding that we stick to the policies we'd accepted at the ADM. For example, instead of talking about banning exploitative zero contracts, I was persistent in demanding, no, we want all of them abolished on the grounds they're all exploitative. And we eventually succeeded getting that into our material. Likewise, with the question of wages, where when the phrase was used sometimes in draft documents of rising towards £10 an hour, we instead managed to get it inserted that was an immediate minimum wage of at least £10, because frankly, £10 even then, let alone today, 3 years later, is out of date. And as an aside, I'll say, for 2 years in a row now, through my branch, we've tried to get the idea of a £12 minimum wage onto the agenda paper of the ADM. And unfortunately, under the leadership of the General Secretary, a majority of the EC have toed the line and blocked that on spurious grounds that it's in breach of the 2-year rule, have been raised the same subject. Well, on that basis, given that the minimum wage is the subject, you would never increase the demand on the minimum wage, because the minimum wage has been discussed before. There's a huge difference between a £10 and a £12 minimum wage for our membership. That's the point. Well, to start with, a 20% difference in their daily and weekly income, but a world of difference in terms of how they could survive in their lives. Now, it may not seem much to some people, but another small step forward that we've achieved as the left is the fact that on a number of occasions, we got Usdaw through its EC to officially send support, solidarity, and sometimes even money to other workers that are in struggle. The first one I raised was the TGI Fridays dispute, then the Harlan and Wolff occupation in Belfast, where we donated £1,000. It wasn't on the agenda paper, we brought it up. Likewise, more recently, we condemned the High Court decision about the postal workers banning their ability to strike after a 97% vote in favour. And in the recent months, after bringing it up twice and me proposing a £10,000 donation, we got £1,000 to the British gas workers facing the obnoxious, blunt instrument of fire and rehire. So it might not seem that much, but actually it is a bit of a change of tradition or habit on the part of Usdaw, certainly compared to my living memory of the union, at least when it comes to other disputes. Likewise, other issues that are not immediately industrial, although I think they are. They're certainly a concern for the wider working class. It was us, those of us who are the socialists on the EC, who argued that the union should send delegations to the strike rallies of young school students on climate change, and we did so. We were there with flags and so on, and the youth well appreciated. So small steps forward towards a more campaigning trade union, because I have to say, I'm a slightly impatient individual, as some will testify. I'm particularly impatient when it comes to people talking a load of baloney about how Usdaw is the campaigning union. Not in my experience, it's not been, but at least we're beginning to move in that direction with some of the pressure we've exerted from within in that respect, with a bit of a broader vision of the wider struggles we're a part of and should be a part of. Now, it was also the socialist minority on the EC who cajoled and pressurised, not just on the street stalls and the online petitions on the policies I mentioned, also on the New Year's shutdown for retail workers, with a small important breakthrough recently in Scotland specifically, where now the Scottish Government has agreed to put that issue out to consultation, which is just a legalistic parliamentary procedure to see if they can get support for it, which we of course will have to build support for amongst the population to ensure it then wins approval. And it's been tenacity in the face of conservatism, tenacity based on our belief in mobilisation, in class struggle politics within the union, compared to the social partnership approach of just pleading with those in power to be nice to us. Now, where we've not succeeded, I think we have to be frank about this, because it's the issue we will face increasingly. Where we've not succeeded is in getting our union leadership to be exact, into a position where they're willing and ready and keen to lead members into industrial action when it's required. I'm not going to go on at length about that, although I could, but let me put it this way. When Tesco announced their first tranche of 9,000 redundancies, which was a monumental job loss, something like, I don't know, something like 4 times the job losses at the famous Ravenscraig steelworks closure in Scotland, which caused all sorts of political seismic changes at the time, increased the support for independence, for example, in 1992. But 9,000 redundancies, I drafted a statement for the EC to discuss, which condemned this, pointed out the profit levels of the company, the fact there was no excuse for it, and to put in essence, argued that what we should do is call emergency special meetings of Tesco members of the union and put the case and lead the case in favour of a consultative ballot to see if members are ready and willing to take industrial action. A consultative ballot, a pre-strike ballot, in other words. And a majority of the executive, led by the General Secretary, defeated that proposal. And some of the arguments used were spurious in its mildest. For example, people who work for Tesco saying that, well, nobody knows us in our own divisions as they see, so why would the EC put out a statement? That same person has subsequently been elected as the president. So presumably she was quite keen to get known, but not at that stage. So I think the arguments against that the EC's never put a statement out before, so what? If the EC is to be a leadership, it needs to give a lead and at least take those kinds of steps and test the willingness of members, because the real danger otherwise, and I've seen this in action, is the argument, well, the members are not willing, we're not being bashed on our doors, the doors are not being kicked in, demand strike action. Well, no, most workers won't do that if they believe their own leadership are not keen to do it, are not keen to lead them. Whereas if the leadership are spelling out the advantages, even of a vote in favour of action, let alone taking the action, then sometimes the employer would beat a retreat and the members will gain confidence. And there's a virtuous circle of emboldening members to be ready for the next fight. And unfortunately, that remains a core weakness, which was also displayed when it came to the question of the Morrison's pay question over a year ago, when myself and Jean, she's a Morrison's worker in particular, pushed the idea, likewise, of a consultative ballot, or a ballot rather, of some form, when the members already rejected the pay offer overwhelmingly, only to discover, or at least we were told, that once it had gone to that stage, it was binding arbitration. Now, if that's not, frankly, the bones of a no-strike deal, I don't know what is, and I'll say that bluntly. I've got nothing to lose in telling the truth. That's how I see it, and I think it's something that has to be changed for the future if that's a fact or reality. Now, when COVID arose as an issue, let's not underestimate the influence of the socialist left within the union in helping to influence what the union said and what the union demanded. Because sometimes, to use the biblical expression, we're too fond of hiding our light under a bushel. We should be proud amongst the membership of the fact we've helped to improve things somewhat at least. For example, I remember in the EC March 2020, at the very beginnings or early stages at least of the coronavirus crisis, proposing the idea that we should demand the temporary shutdown of non-essential retail, but that the workers should be put on full pay during the course of that as a health measure. And it was absolutely mocked or ignored by the overwhelming majority of the executive, including the central leadership. We also argued, both at workplace level and on the executive, for full 100% average pay for any worker who was off either sick or self-isolating. And that was long before this term of furlough became common parlance, by the way. So we were ahead of our times in that regard. And I think it was the right thing to do. It wasn't necessarily a good move, a good career move on my part in bringing that up, but it was the right thing to do, and I've no regrets in doing so in that respect. But we also have had that effect on the union policy about sick pay. We played at least a part in helping to pressurise our own union to join with others in demanding what became known as furlough. Although we argued it should be 100% pay and not 80%, we also tackled the idea that it's not good enough to say everybody should be guaranteed at least the national minimum wage. When some workers are brought down to 80% of the minimum wage, we argued for full average pay for every sick or else isolating a worker, including those also on furlough. So our persistent demands on sick pay are now reflected in some of the very good statements in some of the documents, including the ones for tomorrow's annual delegate meeting, where there's reference to that. And of course, this week at the Scottish TUC, we moved an amendment. I was asked to do so on behalf of Usdaw, moved an amendment to get the policy adopted, which is now Scottish TUC policy, for full average pay for every sick worker from day one, without exception, without qualifying thresholds on income or anything like that, for every worker from day one for as long as it takes to recover, and that statutory sick pay shouldn't be the derisory £96.36 after that wonderful 50p increase this month, but should be the equivalent of £350 for a 37-hour week. That's now STUC policy. So let's be clear, we have had some effect on some of the more fighting and combative and progressive policies of our union. Now, we need a fighting union, mobilising the membership around clear, relevant demands like those, like the minimum working week instead of 0 contracts or unwelcome short-hour contracts, like a £12 minimum wage now, updating the £10 demand, like full average wages for sick workers and so on that I've already explained. I would also add in, with the experience of the pandemic, especially behind us, the idea of workers' control of health and safety in workplaces through elected committees of health and safety reps and shop stewards is something we should pursue through the union and so on. And at the executive and in written form and in public forums, we have raised, some of us on the EC have raised the idea that I know Iain quite rightly referred to there, about public ownership of retail companies that face massive closures or redundancies. And for example, when it came to the discussion around the strategy, the industrial strategy for retail document, one of the things that I repeatedly included was that there should be a distinction between big business and small business. And there's not sufficient distinction made that way when it comes to policies about business tax in that document, for example, but also that we should include measures like the demand for free public transport so that then people could access the high streets, help to survive and revive the high streets could afford to travel into city and town centres, whereas right now many people suffer social isolation as a result of poverty and the rising cost of exorbitant transport services, mostly under privatised profiteering control and ownership. We also raised the idea of a shorter working week without loss of pay as part of a retail strategy. And that now and again gets a past reference in some of the union's material, but I think it needs to become much more centre stage as a modern way of tackling the crisis of joblessness, the crisis of the twin crimes of people working, and I'm sure Jordan could testify to this in particular, people working 12 to 15-hour shifts, dead on their feet, mind-breaking and back-breaking drudgery in various jobs, and at the same time others on 0-hour contracts, short-hour contracts, total insecurity, mass underemployment. So in order to share out the work, but without workers paying the price of that, without loss of pay, with a 4-day week for 5 days pay, ideas like a 6-hour day for 8 hours pay, ideas like that, I think, should become the watchwords of Usdaw and the wider trade union movement as a modern expression of what's required in order to tackle the crisis of capitalism that workers have been made to pay for. So we have fought for those issues. And also, we need to be a fighting union, which means we need to be a democratic union, and vice versa. The two are intertwined. And I have to say, I think one of the areas where there's serious shortcomings is on the question of union democracy in Usdaw. I could give a whole speech for the rest of tonight, and I promise you, reassure you that's not going to happen, about the shortcomings of democracy in practice. Let me pluck out a couple of examples. This union has usually backed the wrong horse as far as I'm concerned when it comes to questions of the Labour leadership. In Scotland, Usdaw backed Jim Murphy, you know, a famous misleader of Scottish Labour. They backed Anna Sauer more recently. We'll see the consequences of that. The same man who up until very recent years refused to recognise Usdaw in the warehouse he owns. And then when we embarrassed him about that subject, he proceeded to hand over his shares to, I think, his children in order to dodge the flak. It doesn't really work that actually from my experience. You're still associated with it. But that's who Usdaw supported. And at a UK level, Keir Starmer. Now that's going well, isn't it? Keir Starmer, who promised, and our executive were reassured, apparently, I'll tell you a bit about that in a moment, our EC were reassured that Keir was the man to unite the Labour Party. He was going to combine embracing those who had supported Jeremy Corbyn with others who were critical of Corbyn. And he was going to unify and revive the Labour Party. Now, I'm not one to pretend to be a psephologist, as they call it in everyday speech in the pub, but I noticed recently some of the opinion polls didn't exactly indicate a roaring success when Labour something like 14%, 14 points behind Boris the buffoon of all people. And also, we see the same Starmer. I mean, it sounds like Alice in Wonderland stuff. We see the position where recently, when the Tory Chancellor was considering the possibility of slightly increasing corporation tax to help to pay for the cost of furlough and the job retention scheme and the handouts to big business and so on, where he was considering that, and he eventually did decide to do it a little bit in a couple of years' time, whereas he's cut benefits in a couple of months' time. But the person who was opposing that was the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer. I mean, history is upside down compared to the past decades. So the Labour Party's on the side of big business, protecting them from the evils of a minor increase from one of the lowest corporation tax levels in the Western world. And the Tories are considering tweaking it upwards slightly. You couldn't make it up. In fact, you don't have to, because it's reality. Now, when our General Secretary was absolutely zealous in his determination to get our union to support and nominate Keir Starmer, he took certain measures that would question the levels of democracy in our union. at our executive, he proceeded to evict myself and Amy as self-proclaimed socialists, and John Barstow, also not a member of the Labour Party, and evicted us from that EC meeting on the grounds that we weren't in the Labour Party. Now, as I pointed out in that meeting, the last I checked, I was elected to the executive of Usdaw and not of the Labour Party. I was expelled from the Labour Party in the mid-80s for being a socialist. I don't remember that also saying I would be expelled from the executive of my own union if the members decided to elect me to that. And likewise for Amy and John, from a different standpoint, the same. We were all elected to represent our members in our divisions, or in Amy's case, as the national president. And the fact that we were removed from that room by a majority vote of the executive, with of course people like Jean protesting and voting against it, is an indication of the lengths some people are prepared to go to ram through a realm of the a knight of the realm in order to become the Labour Party leader, in case people like myself and others would chirp up and say, don't you think that maybe he's not the best bet when it comes to representing the interests of Usdaw members. Now, as a found member of the Scottish Socialist Party over 20 years ago, I frankly didn't have much time for any of the choices when it came to the Labour Party leadership. I don't have any touching faith in the development of the Labour Party in that respect. But that's not the point. I was elected to the Usdaw executive, regardless of my political affiliations, sometimes because of it, sometimes despite it, but primarily because people saw me as somebody they wanted on that body. And the other thing I'll link it in with to draw to a conclusion is the way in which the idea of a single rate of member subs is being rammed through at this ADM over the next couple of days. Now, without going on all night about that issue, it's something that I've taken some verbal abuse for daring to speak out against after the majority of the executive voted in his favour about, what was it, a year and a half ago, I think. Now, I think we've all, as a minority, been very loyal to the union, but our first loyalty is to the membership. And if we think something is of such a profound principle and of such a profound importance to the future of the union and its membership, I think we're duty bound to speak out and warn the consequences. And that's what I've certainly been prepared to do, and others. Because we in the broad left have been prepared to be transparent. We've been transparent in reporting back EC meetings at our divisional councils and our divisional conferences, even when, for example, in the case of our conference, on occasions, the deputy divisional officer heckled me when I was given an EC report. That's how bad it was. But that, despite that, we proceeded to be open, honest, transparent, and accountable to the membership. But when it came to this debate about the single rate, frankly, steps were taken to bypass the executive even before we'd settled upon our views on it. Area officers and divisional officers and so on were brought together and instructed to make sure that they managed to get this measure agreed and rammed through at branch level. And there was a certain amount of suggestion it would be regarded as a performance related issue for those members of staff. They were put in an impossible position of being told, perform or else. And the performance that they were being measured on, the KPI, was getting the single rate through the conference, the ADM, originally last year, now this weekend. That in itself is bad enough for me. Mobilising full-time paid officials, including invading some branches in order to ram it through against the wishes of those who are just ordinary workers. Because let's put it this way, the incomes even of the lowest paid staff in this union are a world apart from that of somebody in a supermarket on an 8-hour contract and on £9.30 or £9.50 or even £10 an hour. And I think it's wrong. I actually think they should be in a separate union for their own good, for their own benefit, the staff. But that aside, I think it's wrong that they've been mobilised in some branches to just overcome the feelings and the views of the ordinary working members of the union. But why am I and others, a minority of us, against the single rate? I'm not going to elaborate greatly, but let me put it in summary. I, first of all, don't believe for 1 minute there's any kind of financial crisis that's an imperative towards getting this. There's £8.7 million of a surplus in the union, and that's before we sell the old building. Whatever amount that raises, we don't know. That's, sensitive commercial issue. So that in itself is an indication of a healthy financial position. But more to the point, even if that wasn't the case, I don't actually believe that a single rate where part-timers from the 1st of July would be expected to pay the full-time rate without exception. That's not, for me, a financial strategy for survival and improvement of the coffers of the union. It's the opposite. It's a recipe for disaster where part-timers will not join at the same levels. They'll feel financed out of the union. They feel they can't afford to join the union in many cases. And the result is that over a period, as the existing staff, through turnover in workplaces, begin to be a lower percentage of the overall membership, then new members will dwindle as a percentage of the workforce in the union. Union density will decline. And the result is that everybody will be damaged, including existing members. And I think also it's utterly unprincipled to try the old "I'm all right, Jack" argument that the existing members are not affected because they'll remain on the lower rate of their part-time rates now. And likewise, I think that is a dirty deployment of the old divide and rule tactic and the two-tier workforce. And it's not good enough to say that employers do that. Yes, employers do. And any decent union fights against two-tier workforces. So why should we apply that within our own union membership? And as I said at an EC meeting, both in anger and quite consciously and coldly, the last time somebody designed that wonderful idea that we just voted by majority in favour of, it didn't go too well. The person who pushed it was called Maggie Thatcher and was called the poll tax, a flat rate tax on every member, regardless of ability to pay. So that's why I've spoken out and make no apology for speaking out against the single rate. I think it's a slow suicide note for this union potentially in terms of dwindling the membership going forward and therefore weakening everybody's strength to fight back. So I'll conclude by saying this. We've won some things. We've made big advances by being persistent and having a vision of what we want. We've got the union committed to a number of really important fighting policies that members can relate to. We've taken that into the wider trade union and labour movement, and we'll need to persist in doing that. We need to build a broad left in the divisions to help to hold people to account, but also to make the membership more conscious of these issues so that they're organised and consciously fighting for these improvements, and in doing so, fight for greater democracy within the union as well. Nothing's predetermined. The future has not yet been written. And I think we can be encouraged, at least, by some of the advances we've made as the socialist left of the union, even though some of them might sound modest. But for some of them, if you turn them into action and into deed, then they become life transforming for ordinary members. So I think we need to lift the sights of our own membership, organise them through the broad left to hold people to account, to stop the slide towards the executive being bypassed, to stop the slide towards the membership sometimes just being duped by false arguments, and to build a real campaigning and democratic and fighting union that can help to meet the challenges that the employers and governments are throwing down before us. So I think it's a source of some encouragement what we've achieved, but there's one hell of a road to travel still. And I think that's the kind of note I'd strike in almost in a sense, reflecting on the past 3 years of working alongside good comrades on the left, on the executive and amongst the membership. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Richie. Yeah, lots of stuff covered. Fantastic stuff there.